Okay, welcome everyone.
Yeah.
As usual, we're going to allow a couple of minutes for folks to continue to arrive and settle in. Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. I just want to mention one administrative detail or housekeeping detail before we get started, which is that you may have noticed that the screen says that we are live streaming on YouTube tonight. And that's not actually the case. Actually, what's happening is that we're using YouTube to capture the recording of the video. And then it will eventually, assuming that all things are well, it will eventually go public up on YouTube. But if there's any reason that it shouldn't, then you should just let me know or let Dana know. And we can take care of that or take care of doing some editing, okay? But we are, in the past we've been recording sessions and now we're just saving one step by having it go ahead and be recorded directly to the YouTube channel. And so, as usual, you should also feel free to have your camera on or off. And it being the Tuesday tune-in, we're going to do the usual program. So just beginning with a short 25-minute or so guided meditation.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd like to do tonight is to try a meditation on the sixth sense basis. Just really get very embodied this evening before we talk about our two topics that I'm going to try to weave together. So just going ahead and settling into your meditation posture. And perhaps before even finding the body, just noticing thoughts coursing through the mind. In a sense, letting the mind just finish whatever ramble it happened to be on before you sat down for the sit. And when you're ready, then shifting to that felt sense of the body settling right there on your seat. Allowing the belly to become soft and relaxed. And from that steady base, perhaps sensing the lightness of the body as you come into an upright posture. Letting the bones do the work of carrying the weight of the body. And checking in with the placement of the hands so that the shoulders can be as relaxed as possible. And then allowing the attention to rest there in the hands. So that you can begin to become aware of the sensation of touch. Many sensations, actually. Just attending with curiosity to the feelings of touch in the hands. Allowing any thoughts that are present to just remain in the background. And staying curious about the sensation of touch. And now shifting the awareness slowly up the body, up the torso, to rest on the sensations of taste. Just resting the attention on sensations of taste. Could be very subtle. And now another shift in attention to the sensations of smell. Just receiving sensations of smell in the moment. Again, could be very subtle, very neutral, but just resting the attention there on the smell. And now, with the eyes either closed or open, attending to the sensations of seeing. Being careful not to strain or stress, just in receptive mode, receiving the sensations of seeing. Staying curious about the sensations of seeing. Observing any shifts from moment to moment. And now, moving the attention again, this time to the sensations of hearing. Just attending to any sensations of hearing. And allowing everything else to fall into the background. Just allowing sounds to come to you and be received of the sensation of hearing. Still attending to the sensations of hearing, noticing how they shift from moment to moment. And finally shifting to the sixth sense base. So receiving thoughts as sensations, just like a sound or a smell. Attending to the mental sensations. And perhaps also noticing the consciousness, the awareness itself in which thoughts are arising. Just receiving mental activity as pure sensation, phenomena arising in the field of awareness. Okay, that was our meditation practice for this evening. Happy to address any questions or comments about that at the end after the Dhamma talk. And I'd ask everybody to mute their mics, please. And I will go ahead and transition now into the Dhamma reflection. So go ahead and make yourselves comfortable. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Mm. It seems to me that we are all, to some degree, aware that there is dukkha, that there is suffering and unsatisfactoriness in the world. Right? We can see it on our phones, on our TVs, in books, in all sorts of newspapers, if you're getting those old-fashioned things anymore. We can see it in our families, in our friends, in our own minds and hearts and bodies, right? I think that there's no one who believes that they are immune from suffering. Or that somehow the world could be entirely free of that. But the question before us as practitioners is, what is a skillful response to that? How to really meet that fact? How to really find our peace even in the midst of that. I hadn't planned on saying this, but there's a Dhammapada, it brings to mind this Dhammapada phrase, in the midst of those who are angry, we will walk without anger. In the midst of those who are fearful, we will walk without fear. So how to find that ability? How to find that ability to be present with what is in terms of dukkha, and begin to really know the benefits of practice, the benefit of the relief that can come with practice, the clarity and the relief. And so generally speaking, as I mentioned before, I'm going to try to weave together two topics tonight. So generally speaking, the Buddhist teaching around suffering is to meet it with compassion, right? And in early Buddhism, compassion is defined as exactly that, as knowing that there is dukkha, that there is suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and being willing to meet that as a fact, and meet that in our actual lived experience. So simply just the intention that beings would be free from harm, beings would be freed, relieved of their dukkha. And so there are two main ways that compassion's talked about in the early suttas. And the two main ways that we see are karuna and anukampa. I'm going to say a little bit more about each of those. But I want to say, oftentimes what happens when we see dukkha, particularly in the world, but also sometimes in ourselves, is that compassion is not the first thing that comes up, right? Anger sometimes is the first thing that comes up. And it shouldn't be like that. Or perhaps a sense of indignation or a sense of disbelief that people make the choices that they do. They make the choices to go to war, or they make the choices to harm one another. So sometimes when we see suffering, it makes us sad, or it makes us angry, or sometimes numb. There are various ways that we can experience the sankharas that arise out of seeing suffering in the world. And so, you know, there's a very simple instruction about that, which is to begin with understanding your own situation, your own desire to be free from suffering yourself, and think, right, and other beings also want that, despite the fact that sometimes they behave in ways that it isn't apparent that they want less suffering. It's just because of their confusion, right? That they're doing things, making those kinds of poor choices. But truly, they want to be free from suffering as well. They want to find their own happiness. So the Buddha begins, and early Buddhist teachers usually begin with this sense of finding empathy by starting with our own situation. And I want to give an example of that from a while ago that happened for me in a very surprising way, because when I hear that, to start with oneself and then think that other beings want to be like that, again, I think sometimes there was the skeptic in me, like, right, well, if they really want to be free from suffering, they wouldn't be making those choices, right? So there was this sense of frustration, or again, sort of skepticism or lack of clarity. But there I was, and I was a chaplain. I was a spiritual care provider in a hospital in a little town called Concord, California. And so pretty much an hour or so directly east of San Francisco Bay Area. And I was there doing my training, my chaplaincy training, second round of chaplaincy training. And so we were assigned in the chaplaincy training to 2 units at a time for 6 months at a time. And then is a year-long training. And so you had 2 units the first 6 months and 2 units the second 6 months. And during my first 6 months, I had one of my 2 units was this, the ward, which was for people with like chronic illness. So people who would come in for dialysis, for example, or people with diabetes, different kinds of conditions related to chronic illness. And so it's folks, oftentimes it was the same folks who would come again and again. It's quite a difficult challenge to sort of meet that situation of people feeling like this was going to keep going on. But in particular, there was a guy who was on the ward. There was a man who was on the ward one time, who wasn't there because of chronic illness. He was there because it was a ward where there was the best staffing, what they thought was the best staffing for him. And this gentleman was what the nurses used to call a screamer. He was somebody who would yell at anybody who walked in the room. That was just his way of relating, literally. And he would scream and yell and cuss people out all day long. And they had to have him close to the nursing station because, periodically people would be going in and trying to soothe him in one way or another, respond to some yelled request, or, escort somebody else out of the room so that they wouldn't be subjected to that. And so people were kind of at their wits' end with him. And even I have to say, for me, like, one of the most unpleasant situations in being a hospital chaplain is having somebody screaming obscenities at you and kicking you out of their room. That's a very unpleasant part of the day, right? And so, but this gentleman, he was going to be there for a while. I forget what exactly happened, what kind of procedure or something, which is good because that's his, medical information. But anyway, he was going to be there for a period of like 3 or 4 weeks, if I remember correctly. And so we were just like, wow, what are we going to do with this gentleman? And so I thought, well, let me see if I can apply this teaching, right? So I don't like this situation, this yelling and this difficulty and stuff, but what's going on for him, right? I mean, obviously there's something that is tremendously painful for him that he is behaving this way. Not just physically painful, because according to what we could tell by the medicine, his pain was controlled, but there's something mentally very painful happening for him. And so I looked at his situation and I realized that they had him in a bed in his room where he didn't have access to a window at all. Because again, they wanted him to be close to the nursing station so they could respond when he was yelling out requests. And I thought, wow, if it were me and I were in a bed where I couldn't see a window, I couldn't see anything green for days or weeks at a time, I think that would really impact my mental state. That would seem quite difficult. And so I went to the nurse who was taking care of this gentleman and I said, what do you think about this idea? I think we should put him in a wheelchair and walk him over to the window. Not the window in his room, but there was like almost a floor to ceiling window in the hallway over by the elevators. And just give him a chance to like see some green, see some sky, just enjoy even just a moment of being able to see the outdoors. And maybe that would be a relief to him. They say that that's actually very calming, right? So, okay, the nurse was quite skeptical, but she said, okay, let's give it a try. Let's put him in a wheelchair and let's give it a try. So she put it in a very large man, difficult, again, to move around and all this. We had to convince him that we were going to go for a little walk and that it was going to be good for him. And please, would he come with us? And he said, okay, somehow through the screaming. And we got him into a wheelchair and rolled him over to the window. And we all three stood. So I stood on one side and the nurse stood on the other side and he was in the wheelchair between us. And we all stood there just looking out the window for a moment. And he got really quiet. And I was kind of bracing myself, like waiting for the next, set of expletives and stuff to come. The next set of screaming. And he stayed really quiet for a few minutes. And then finally, he opened his mouth and very quietly he said, wow, the sky is so blue. That's it. That's all he had to say. And then he got quiet again for a little while. And the nurse looked at me and I looked at her and I said, okay, great. We'll take that. We'll take that as a win. That's the nicest thing he said like in the last week or so. And he seems like he's calmed down enough that he could be quiet for a little while. So I was surprised, right? That actually worked a bit to put myself in his shoes about what it felt like. And that even that small gesture of empathy for him made a difference. Not in the long term. He didn't have a huge change of personality, right? He was still a difficult person to work with and be with. But he had a shift. He had some moments of relief, and he had a recognition that we tried to do something to help him. In fact, he mentioned it the next few times that I saw him. You know? So this mundane empathy doesn't fully resolve the suffering, but it does bring us closer to each other and to understanding dukkha, which is essentially our task, right? This is the task that the Buddha gave in his first talk, to understand dukkha really intimately. But the other thing that I want to say is this part about anger. So this is the other topic that I'm trying to weave in here. So anger or ill will. At times it can feel very justified, or it can feel very appropriate, or it can feel very powerful. I think I myself in my younger life, I felt like anger was a good tool for feeling stronger and more powerful than I actually was, or than I actually felt inside. And so, or we may be just, you know, it may be true, it often is true, that people are making poor choices, or that there are alternatives to what's happening. But the anger itself is another issue. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the Buddha says about anger as a hindrance to our practice, because I feel like that is something that we can start to think about even when we're not on the cushion, even when we're not seated and trying to meditate. We can start to think about how anger is a hindrance in seeing clearly in our lives. And so there's a sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya that I want to talk about just a little bit today. And it's a sutta number 2 from the suttas on the 7 factors of awakening, actually, the Bojjhanga. And it's the sutta is just called the body, and it talks about the so-called nutriments, the things, the literal like food or fuel for both the hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening. So it goes through each one of these things and talks about what's the fuel, what's the food for those qualities of mind. Because, as the Buddha says, just as this body is sustained by nutriment, sustained by food, by fuel, it subsists in dependence on nutriment and does not subsist without nutriment, so too the 5 hindrances are sustained by nutriment, are subsist in dependence on food, on, and do not exist without those fuels or foods, nutriments. And so he goes on and he says about ill will in particular, right? So ill will is the second of the 5 hindrances. And he goes on and he says, what is the nutriment, the food, the fuel for the arising of unarisen ill will and for the increase and expansion of arisen ill will? So whether you are already angry and fueling that, or whether you are not yet angry, but providing the fuel and the conditions such that anger is going to come forward in the future, what is the fuel? The fuel is the quote unquote sign of the repulsive is the word that Bhikkhu Buddha uses. But I would say something like the thing that causes you aversion. In fact, in the commentaries, they use this word, aversion, right? So the sign of something that is unpleasant, has an unpleasant feeling tone. And by the sign, we mean the way that you know it, the perception of it, right? The way that it comes into your consciousness. And he says, giving careless attention to that. So very important is the factor of attention. So the difference, what he's pointing at here, is not the fact that there are things which have the tendency to be unpleasant for us and that we should remove them. That's not the instruction here. The instruction is when those things are present, we need to use careful attention, how we look at them, how we observe them, how we interact with them mentally. Right? Do we hold on to these things? Do we identify? Do we build a big story and a head of steam? Or do we see this as a phenomena? Right? Do we see this as a set of phenomena? So frequently giving careless attention to those things which are repulsive or which tend to lead to aversion, right? And again, careless attention meaning this kind of clinging or this kind of storytelling or reactivity, right? Buying into that, fueling that, right? With our attention, telling ourselves that story over and over again, for example, right? These are the ways that the ill will is made stronger. And then looking at the footnotes here, so I highly recommend that when you read the suttas, that you have a look at the footnotes that are in the back. Sometimes they're too technical to be useful, but oftentimes there's some really good information back there. And so in this case, we have, for the hindrances, we have more information that comes out of the commentaries, about also different responses that are helpful when ill will is arising. So if you can't find compassion right away from observing dukkha or observing suffering in yourself or in the world, and anger arises, then one thing that you can think about is turning toward loving kindness. That's the first. So loving kindness meditation is usually the first suggestion of a practice to do when to counter anger. And I want to say two things about that. So first of all, whenever we have a state like that, anger, which has a lot of energy around it and a lot of story around it, it can be very hard to shift to something really beautiful and bright and spacious, like the Brahma Viharas. It can be really hard. So if that's not possible, don't force it, right? Don't criticize yourself for that. It just so happens that you have a lot of energy in a different direction. So there are other responses that are possible, right? But in the moments when you don't have that big, hot head of energy, that's the time to be practicing the loving kindness and the compassion, right? So that you build that intention and build that energy and that habitual response in the mind. So you do it, sort of offline. You do it when it's easy. And then when the tough moments come, then the tendency will be more built in there. You have a better chance at it. You have a better shot at it, right? Because we know, and goodness knows I'm not an expert at this, but we do know, both from the suttas and from science, that whatever we repeat with the mind becomes its basic tendency, right? It becomes that response that comes up before you, sometimes before you think that you have made a choice, right? There's some response. And so the more that we build these kinds of intentions, these kinds of positive states, and habituate the mind to them, the more trust we can also have in our spontaneous responses, right? Because if you feel like your spontaneous responses are also always making more trouble, then that's also a difficulty. It's also something that tends to lead to a kind of self-criticism and a kind of uncertainty that's difficult. So building up those tendencies so that the spontaneous responses can be more skillful. So anyway, abandoning ill will by learning the loving kindness as an object. And so by that, it means really just even thinking about the concept of loving kindness is helpful. Then the second one is devotion to meditation on loving kindness. So some of you come on Thursdays or have been on retreats or been on heard other free Dhamma talk guided meditations on loving kindness, on metta, right? There's a recitation form where we talk through various phrases, and then there's the radiating form. And interestingly, just stepping back for a second, the commentary says, even before giving these 6 things that lead to abandoning ill will, the commentary says, the liberation of the mind through loving kindness is jhana, is deep absorption and clarity of mind. So conversely, that makes us think, right, that having a lot of ill will in the mind makes it very difficult, right, to find that settled space and that clarity in the mind. There's too much agitation for that, and not too much energy, because you need a lot of energy. And actually, I would say loving kindness, in my experience, releases a tremendous amount of energy in the form of piti, in the form of joy and light. But it's obviously a different kind of energy than the ill will. And then, interestingly, this third one, reflecting on one's responsibility for one's own actions. So this is a very interesting response to anger. So what does that mean? Reflecting on responsibility for one's own actions. It means, first of all, that what you do has an effect. What you do, right, matters, and it has an effect. Even if we're outside of the scope of karma, which karma would certainly explain that, and then some, right? But even outside the scope of karma, just to say, and if you're not sure about that, in the regular mundane world, what you do and what you say matters. It has repercussions, right? So those things are true. So reflecting on that, if you're going to act out of anger, for example, or you're going to speak out of anger, then chances are pretty good there's some repercussion that comes out of that. So that's one thing. But the second aspect of this, reflecting on one's own, let me make sure I get the phrase exactly right again. Reflecting on one's responsibility for one's own actions. So the other part of that is knowing that the anger that I feel is not generated by the external world. The anger that I feel is in my own mind. It's in my own mind. No matter what's happening to me, literally, even in the most horrific things, when there's anger there, that is additive to whatever the situation is. And I'll give you an example that for me is quite inspiring. And I was looking up this quote again because that was a reason why some of you are on before me today. Because I find this quote quite inspiring. And it's from Nelson Mandela. So many of you know who that is. Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa. But prior to being the president of South Africa, right, he was in jail for 27 years. for protesting human rights violations in his own country, against his Black people in his own country. Yeah. And he's had this to say. So after 27 years of being in jail for doing and saying the right things, he was released in 1990. And some of you may know this quote. What did he say? He said, "I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom. And I knew if I didn't leave bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. If I didn't leave bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison." But he made that choice to leave it behind, to not be in that prison. And for that reason and many others, he became a very, very inspiring leader for many people. So taking responsibility, thinking about our responsibility for our own actions and our own thoughts. And then frequent consideration. This means really frequent consideration of the Dhamma, thinking about the teaching, reminding yourself about the teaching. Why is it that these are the suggestions? Does it really work like that? Is this what I see in my own heart and mind when I respond in these ways, or when I fuel it in these ways? How does that work? And then good friendship, good Dhamma friendship, right? In part, people who can talk you down off of that, off of that very high perch, right? Or just help you acknowledge how painful anger is, right? Because anger hurts physically, right? It is unpleasant. It is really unpleasant. So good friends who will help you with that. And suitable talk. So again, knowing about, knowing how to speak skillfully. And for folks in the book club, we're going to talk about right speech on Thursday. But again, using skillful speech such that it doesn't inflame your own heart. It doesn't lead you to add that extra burn. And so one other quote from Nelson Mandela, and then I'm going to try to wrap it up here. And so anger is a difficult one. The other thing that that Bhikkhu Bodhi adds in the footnote there is that ill will, the hindrance of ill will, is relinquished at the stage of non-returner. That means you're already 2 stages into the 4 stages of awakening before ill will completely goes away, right? So it's a task. I give you that, right? It's a task that we're all going to be working on. And so you also need to just give yourself that room to say, yes, right, it is something I'm going to be working on. So don't add the 2nd and 3rd and 4th arrow of criticizing yourself when it happens. But just start to begin to acknowledge it and work with it when it happens. And so again, Nelson Mandela's quote about this, or it wasn't about this, it was actually about political things, but I think is relevant. I'm going to use it here in a different sense, which is, he says, it always seems impossible until it's done. It always seems impossible until it's done. So thinking about being free of anger, being free from ill will, it always seems impossible until it's actually done. And you can just have moments, even just if you sometimes during the day, Venerable Analayo loves to talk about this. Actually, my one of the folks who I know a little bit in the Dhamma, and who's a very respected teacher, says, every once in a while you could look around in your mind and go, wow, look, there's no ill will. And like pat yourself on the back for that, right? Then that's a pamoja opportunity. Some of you have heard me talk about pamoja, right? The joy of enjoying your own practice, enjoying you doing the right thing with your life. So, so finally, I just want to wrap it up again by saying that we have karuna and we have anukampa, the two different kinds of compassion. And so karuna being this kind of quality that can pervade all things, similar to the loving kindness practice. It's one of the other Brahma Viharas. And anukampa is a word that means compassion in action. So all these other things that we're talking about in terms of exactly that. How do you talk to yourself? How do you empathize with other people? How do you take an active role in responding to your anger? That's anukampa. That's compassion in action. Not compassion as a meditation, but compassion in actual activity in your life. Responding to yourself with compassion when these hindrances arise, when harmful states start to arise. And responding to a world that's also caught up in that, right? To some degree or another. Not all the time, but when it is, we can do our best to bring that compassionate response. To know that we, like Nelson Mandela did, we can make that choice to leave hatred and bitterness behind and find our freedom. All right.